So welcome everybody to the last of this winter's Superstudio lectures. It's coming from across Canada. We're very lucky this afternoon to have Robert Raynor from Toronto Metropolitan University. My name's Adrian Blackwell. I'm a member of the organizing committee with Architects Against Housing Alienation. And I'm going to start with a brief land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the School of Architecture in the University of Waterloo is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. The Superstudio is centrally concerned with the rights of all people to affordable housing, environmental justice, and equity. Across all of the sites across Canada that we'll be focusing on throughout this semester, there have been ongoing issues of disparity and oppression initiated through violent processes of European colonization that included the displacement of Indigenous peoples from across the lands that sustained them on Turtle Island. Within the Superstudio, we seek ways to recognize and respect the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples of the various regions that we're working in and their inherent right to be at home in the cities that now occupy their lands, in order to design a more accessible, ecologically sound, and economically sustainable home for all human and non-human life. So, as I said, we're really lucky to have Robert Raynor here today. Robert is teaching at Toronto Metropolitan University, and he's going to present, I think, some work related to that teaching. But I got to know Robert through the Venice Biennale project that Architects Against Housing Alienation curated, and his work on intentional communities for unhoused people. He's a designer, researcher, maker, and amplifier of voices. He holds a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Toronto with a background in woodworking, life cycle carbon analysis, and community engagement for chronically unhoused populations. His work has been featured in the Venice Biennale, as I said, at Design TO. He's the director of Shelter Not-for-Profit Two Steps Homes, and is a founder of Taz's Circular Living Lab. And he's the design lead at Better Street. So thanks so much, Robert. Welcome.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, folks who are on the call. Thanks for folks who are tuning in after the fact. Today, I want to share with you uh, the culmination of a course that I taught this past fall at TMU and the work that we did. This is a talk called "House as a Verb." Everyone can see my screen okay here? Perfect. Okay, so this course that I taught was called Everything is Housing. It was in the fall of 2025 at Toronto Metropolitan University's Department of Architectural Science. And this was a fourth year bachelor's course and second year master's of architecture course. So it was a hybrid between both groups. It was a seminar and elective. And this course went through looking at four different crises that we face in Canada today. The four that we looked at were the housing crisis, the climate crisis, the homelessness crisis, and a crisis of connection in an increasingly alienated world. And so I'll start by talking about the housing crisis and what it is that we spoke about in this course and how it relates to the idea of housing as a verb. We began by situating ourselves, being TMU. This course was Toronto focused. We situated ourselves within the Greater Toronto Area, and within Toronto proper, there are three main rivers, two of which had among the earliest settlements in this area, Taagon and also at the end of the Rouge River were two Seneca communities. Each of these communities were built of about 30 to 50 longhouses, so approximately 500 to 800 people in each settlement, and these were built at the foot of the Humber River, which was the carrying place trail in Toronto, as well as at the foot of the Rouge River over here too. The each community was around and kind of sometime in and around the 1300s is my understanding here, and was really there until the French came in and in attempting to control the beaver trade that was going up and down the Carrying Place Trail, ended up engaging in a long period known as the Beaver Wars that very unfortunately wiped out the Seneca from these areas, and they created two different forts, Fort Duville and Fort Toronto. Um, After subsequent battles with the British, uh, York was established in the early 1800s. This is one of the earliest sort of known images of what it looks like, a painting of it. Um, and around this time, there were a series of treaties that were and purchases that were supposedly made. Uh, with the area that Toronto occupies primarily being under Treaty 13 in 1805. The reason why I bring this up here, firstly, it's important for us to understand the history of where we are. Um, but in thinking about the active housing, a lot of the active housing in Toronto comes from the way that Toronto is laid out and the way that land is distributed among, in terms of who's able to use it and in terms of how people acquire it. And so for this, I now want to enter the British planning system when the British took over this area of what became Upper Canada. Um, this original early plan of York from 1818. This is something that you can see not too many streets, but those that are there are primarily large residences on open farm fields. And going a little bit further into 1834, you can start to see a grid that's being established throughout the city of Toronto. Now, this grid, for those who are familiar with the city, we have several street names that are all too familiar to folks in the Greater Toronto Area. And you can see that these were laid out in 2 kilometer increments. In fact, they were 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grids with streets that went east-west as well as north-south, further split into small little parcels. Now, these parcels really, by today's standards, are not small. If we take a look at this across all of southern Ontario and kind of zooming out further and further, you can see this implication of the grid over the existing topography was something that extended far and wide. This map from 1860 in the City of Toronto archives, one of my favorite, was so fast, such a fascinating map. If you zoom in, you can start to see the names of different people. And effectively, what happened here was we had loyalists coming from the US after the American Revolution. And the government, the British government, who was kind of organizing Upper Canada at the time, said, you can come here. This is a safe place for you. We will provide you with land, and then you're able to farm on that land and develop that land as you see fit. And so these 100-acre or 200-acre or 1,000-acre plots of land were given to different folks. And you can see the names on here of people. There's the Cooper, there's JP Rideau, and Rideau is name of a street in Roncesvalles in Toronto. John Ellis, Ellis Ave near High Park. You can start to see kind of where these came from, and the housing that was built at the time was effectively looked like this. We had churches and there were more cultural institutions, but broadly, the replacement of the replacement of what previously were as a form of permanent housing were longhouses, shifted towards small buildings that built their way up into these developments on plots of land that were owned by people who were gifted this land primarily or were able to buy it for very little. And over time, you take a look, this is a Godes fire insurance map from the era. And you can see this section owned by E. Blong was in 1904, was not particularly developed, but by 1913, you can see that there are plots of land that have been divided up among it. You can see buildings start to be built on it. And taking a look in this map between the colors of the yellow and the red, these represent the materiality of the buildings that were on this land. So we have yellow being stick frame, being wood construction, and we have red being brick construction, masonry construction. This is a fire insurance map, and this was relevant especially after the Great Fire of Toronto in 1904. After this point of time, not only was there a stronger push towards looking to build buildings that were going to last longer and be more fire resistant, but there also came more kind of hard rules around what could be built where, and the amount of money that was required to build those buildings, where that would be spent. This district map of areas in the city of Toronto in the southern kind of what's currently downtown. District A refers to areas that could only be built with brick buildings. District B was, I think it was brick buildings, but you could have accessory units that were made of wood. District C was one level lower again, and District D was everything could be built out of wood. And very broadly, this corresponds to the way that wealth is kind of distributed over time in the city of Toronto at a high level. District A is among the wealthiest area in Toronto, 100 and something, 122 years later. Um, we also see around the similar time the rise of apartment buildings. So the very first apartment building in Toronto was Spadina Gardens, which is currently in the annex. And we had also a similar situation to some of the things we face today, which is that when this building was built, there was a lot of backlash from the community. They said they didn't want something this tall at, I think it's 4 stories. Um, and this was built primarily to be able to house recent immigrants and people who weren't otherwise able to afford the plots of land that had accrued in value since they were first plotted off in the uh, like mid to late 1800s. And so during this time, the result of this ended up being quite a lot of rules and regulations were put into place regarding how we build, where we build. The first bylaws in the city of Toronto were starting to be established here, trying to ensure that buildings were built in areas where locals would not be against them. And so kind of the this was the father of the yellow belt in Toronto, so to speak, in many ways. Moving forward a little bit, by the 1940s, yes, we had the Yellow Belt. We had large areas within the city of Toronto that were specifically designated for certain types of housing. And then we had a lot of farmland outside of the city of Toronto. And we had a housing shortage post World War II. Toronto's population at this time was about 650,000. And so as a result of this, the focus became how do we build as much housing as possible? And the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation enters the conversation. The goal here being that they would be able to provide loans in order to get spur development and get more people into to housing. And the type of housing that was built looked approximately something like this: a lot of small post-war bungalows and post-war detached homes, catalog homes through Sears catalog. And in the 10 years or so that followed after World War II, Canada built 1 million new homes. Now, if we take a look at this in relation to Toronto's population growth, this is a graph that represents the growth of Toronto proper and the growth of kind of the surrounding area. And you can see from just after World War I in 1951, we're sitting around 1.2 million people, and we're up to about 1.8 million people just in Toronto in the decade that followed. And we also see how this really starts to taper off over time. Now, reason for this being that Toronto proper, you can see being in blue, really started to become decently landlocked in terms of kind of low-lying buildings. And so a lot of Toronto's census metropolitan region, which is Durham region, Peel region, York region, these really took on the bulk of new people who were coming into the area. And effectively, this can be split into sprawl intensification. If we look at the housing in Toronto and the population since 1971, we've gone up by 800,000 people since 1971. And in the 20 years before that, we had gone up by the same. So in the 55 years, we've gone up by as many people in Toronto proper as we did in the 20 years prior, which is quite something when you think about this. And this, of course, has led to so much sprawl within the region. On top of the fact that we have all of the sprawl, we have this densification, or this need for densification. We then need to figure out how we go about that process of densifying, and it's a costly one. Taking a look at my students in this course took a look at the Altus Cost Guide, which is a tool that developers often use to build buildings, understand the costs associated with building them. And when we combine kind of medium rise to high rise construction costs alongside underground parking requirements, or goals that architects and developers tend to, more so developers tend to put in these projects. Typically, the cost of construction these days in the Greater Toronto Area is about $450 per square foot. Um, Now, this is for medium and high-rise buildings, and of course, looking at densification. If the goal is to bring more people into the city of Toronto, the way that we do that today often tends to be through densification rather than expanding our suburbs if we're talking about Toronto proper. And so as a class, we actually went through the process of costing out at a high level what a building would cost to build. We said, we have 250 units here. We'll assume a 750 square foot unit average size. So slightly on the small side if it's an average, because we're also assuming 2 and 3 bedroom units. But nevertheless, we are needing approximately 220,000 square feet. Apologies, this isn't in square meters, but Altus works in square feet, so we're stuck with it. For current averages of this, if we take that $450 per square foot cost, multiply it by our 187,500 square foot unit requirement specifically for the units of the building, we're looking at about $85 million for just hard costs. When we add in fees, we add in contingencies, we add in financing, we're looking at about $112 million to build 250 units of housing in a situation where it's very challenging to build low density in new areas, and we're trying to build as much density as we can. So ultimately, housing is expensive, and we need a lot of housing. And this is a challenge that we faced post World War II, where we needed to build 1 million units of housing in 10 years, and that was done. And today, it's a similar situation. Build Canada Homes has recently come into the fold as a way of trying to spur development and especially affordable housing development at the federal government level. If we take a look at the number of housing starts and buildings that are in development and housing that's in development throughout Southern Ontario, you can see a lot of it is still clustered around Toronto and around Mississauga and around some of the larger population centers. And Ontario specifically, reports are saying, this was, as of last summer, Ontario needs to build more than 2 million homes in the next decade. And so we have this very challenging situation where, their target of 1.5 million homes by 2031 in the next 5 years may not be enough to meet demand, and that up to 2.1 million might be needed to improve affordability. Um, there are many different facets to affordability. Housing supply is just one of them, but nevertheless, it still is an important thing to consider, an important anchor for us as architects, designers, planners, that Ontario alone needs twice as many homes built in a shorter period of time than all of Canada did post World War II. Um, the housing crisis is quite a challenge. There are so many different facets to this, and I've barely scratched the surface. But I now want to juxtapose this by talking about the climate crisis. We need to build housing, but I want to turn to talking about carbon. Um, Carbon is a science class refresher. Carbon is an element. It's on the periodic table of elements. There's a finite amount of this element on our Earth, and it cycles through different reservoirs. So it cycles through rocks, it cycles through animals, plants, and the atmosphere. Um, and animals will eat plants. Humans will eat animals, or other animals will eat animals, or the animal will die, and carbon is released into the atmosphere, where it's taken in by plants. We eat plants, and it enters us. We die, and it goes back into the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. The challenge here is that carbon in the atmosphere, it's a double-edged sword. It traps heat from the sun. So we wouldn't exist if the atmosphere didn't have the exact amount of carbon that it does. But likewise, too much carbon in the atmosphere traps too much heat from the sun. And so this excess heat impacts most of the biological processes on Earth, and we're on track to be well above the 1.5 degree kind of warming limit that has been suggested by the United Nations and other groups. This comes down to mitigation versus adaptation. Um, and once we surpass that 1.5 limit, the frequency of natural phenomena happening, landslides, hurricanes, large weather events, heat waves, etc., those broadly outpace our ability to adapt our infrastructure to accommodate these challenges. When we take a look at per capita greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, this is a map from a couple of years ago, but we can see that we're up here, and this is a quite a challenge. We're definitely one of the worst emitters in the world, we as Canada. And if we take a look at this overview of per capita GHG emissions, past the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Australia, we're ahead of the United States. We're well over double the average of South America. We're almost triple the European Union average and the world average. And this is even more interesting when you think to yourself, well, Canada is a cold climate, so we have to deal with extra heating compared to most other cold climate countries that smaller countries in the world, we're a massively more emissive. Why are we talking about this in relation to housing? The challenge here is that the extraction and the production of all building materials release excess carbon into the atmosphere. So we have this challenge where we have to generate power. That power goes to the grid. That grid goes to supply energy for the vehicles and all the tools that extract raw material from the earth. That material is taken by train, taken by boat, or taken by truck to processing plants where it's turned into materials that we as architects and designers and planners use. It's then transported to site, and then it's put into our buildings on site. And this whole process of it's called cradle to gate of trying to build your building releases greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere at every stage. And if we were to add it up, the building sector is responsible for 34% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of those, about 18% is just cement and steel. A lot of that is also operational, but strictly in terms of embodied carbon, the carbon from the materials themselves, it's still quite a challenging number. And I also want to draw attention to something that the UNEP mentioned a couple of years back. Half of the world's buildings that will exist by 2050 have not yet been built. So in the next 24 years, the number of buildings that will exist will be more than double what we have now. And or the number of buildings that we need to build will be significantly more than what has yet to be built. And so with this challenge, we really face a dilemma here. We need to build more housing, and we also need to pollute less. And these things are antithetical. They're very challenging to do because by necessity, building more housing means also polluting more, polluting the atmosphere more. And being able to pollute less means needing to find alternative ways of housing. So how do we begin to tackle these problems? The challenge here, I believe, is best solved by asking questions. In order to know where to go, we need to know where we are. We need to be focused on trying to learn as much as we can about the challenges that we face. And so for this class, for Everything is Housing, uh, students were asked to ask questions. What makes a good question? Well, the first thing that you want to do is you want to ask why. You don't want to manufacture connection. You want to try to figure out why something is the way it is, not just say, what is the relationship between random thing here and random thing here. You want to ask what you want to understand. You don't want to just ask the things that you think are good questions, but truly, sit with yourself and think, what is the thing that you want to understand? Think about systems thinking. So no binaries, not is X better than Y, or is of X and Y, what's the path forward here? We want to go with thinking more as a system. Keep it simple. The best questions are not essays. Trying to understand other people's thinking rather than fearing what you might find. And similarly to that, detaching from any particular outcome. So not holding on too tightly to your initial thought, your initial belief as to why something is the way it is. The goal of asking a question is to be curious. It's not to ask what you already know. And so with this, the assignment that students and everything is housing worked on over the course of the term were a series of questions on housing. And so the semester broadly went something like this. Students proposed three big questions on housing that they were curious about. From there, we worked through them together. They chose one question. They made that question as precise as they could, worded in a very specific way with the goal of trying to be as clear as possible with their intentions. And then did an initial research dive, created an annotated bibliography of useful sources, not just here are all the sources on this topic, but what were the sources that were useful to build understanding, and then became familiar with their topics and took a stance based on what they learned. What do they think is working? What might they argue in relation to their question? What pieces remain unanswered? And finally, they illustrated their arguments, the gaps that existed, in an easily digestible way, um, where both a first year student and a longtime prof would be able to learn something new. And so the questions that were put forward were quite a range. What buildings are most suitable for adaptive reuse and resiliency? Do different housing unit layouts affect affordability? Why should we be building for resilience when we need to build quickly? Is that a dichotomy that's true? What happens when parking minimums are really removed? Do women's shelters need to feel carceral to be safe? Can building standards evolve to drive sustainable housing? Why do we not build 15-minute cities? Why are we not there yet? Um, why aren't adaptive reuse of office buildings as common as they could be? How do we incentivize quality housing? Can cities densify and maintain the same cost of living? Can prefabricated housing allow for self-identity? Can we build sustainably and affordably? The questions went on, and students had a wide range of topics and things that they wanted to discuss and dive into for themselves. Um, and so this took place over a good chunk of the semester. And at the end of the 48 student series of questions, we created an exhibition. So this exhibition was called House as a Verb, where all of these questions were displayed on a wall. And then the answers to these questions, the stances taken, were created in the form of zines. And so that's where students were able to take their questions, show them graphically, and then place them into this exhibition where the public could come and read about the zines. I want to end by talking about my own question on housing, the thing that kind of got me started and into this process, and that was, why would someone choose to sleep in a tent in a park in the winter? This brings me to the homelessness crisis side of this course, and uh, I'm almost done, but I want to share an analogy here, which is I want you to think that the poverty line is like the edge of a cliff. If the poverty line is like the edge of a cliff, there's water below. And when there's water below, uh, over time, as you find yourself in a situation where you're pushed past the poverty line, you fall off the water, or you fall off the cliff and you fall into the water below. Now, you can be there for a little while. You can tread water, but eventually the body fatigues, and you'll find that you're no longer able to tread water. This is homelessness. This is being in a park. This is living unsheltered and outdoors. Now, the shelter system in the city, in many cities, is like a lifesaver. It's like someone who has a lifesaver and throws that lifesaver down to you, and so now you're floating and you're no longer worried about having to drown in the water. But the challenge is that oftentimes, there is no rope attached back up to the top of the cliff. So there's no way for you to get back up there. You're still in the shelter system. You're not going to drown. You're not going to die immediately. But you're nevertheless stuck in a situation where there isn't often an easy place to go. Now, alternatively, what if there was something where there was a rope that was attached to the lifesaver? And maybe it's hard for one person, but if you get enough people together, you're able to pull someone back up to safety. The things that I've heard in working in encampments over the last several years, folks saying, I can't sleep in a room with 100 people. Someone's always shouting. I can only bring in 2 bags of stuff. My dog isn't allowed. My medication gets stolen every night. I have to choose between a warm bed or not having seizures during the day. I can't use my substance of choice in the shelter. And we really start to realize that this is a situation of needs not being met. And if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and dividing this across different forms of architecture and different things that buildings and different things that housing provide us, we can see that as we go through and look at different opportunities for people who are sleeping rough, we have emergency shelter, which has some physiological benefits, some safety and security benefits, um, but really lacks in love and belonging or esteem and the ability to curate your own space. Shelters are a little better, but you still don't know the people around you very often. Um, Encampments, you can see really start to focus more on the personal agency, respect among your community, sense of friendship that's found in a way that isn't in a lot of isn't in a lot of shelters. And when we look at transitional housing, again, these types of situations, it's not always the case that you know your community when you're moving somewhere. And so really trying to understand what's the goal, what's a thing that will combine those kind of physiological and safety benefits of shelter with the sense of belonging and agency found in encampments. This is the type of work that broadly that I'm working on at the moment with a group called Two Steps Home and Cabin Communities. And so this leads me to the final piece, which is the crisis of connection. One of my favorite quotes is by Simone Weil. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. And looking at the shelter system, looking at how we build those lifesavers that have a rope attached, connection is, I believe, to be that form. And this leads to a distinction between house and home. Uh, you know, I think that housing is as much a verb as it is a noun. We build housing, but we also must not forget how to house in the process of building housing. And so I believe, to house well is to it's to bless someone with the soil that they need to take root. It's to understand their needs, it's to respond to them, to recognize their own growing conditions, and create an environment where they can prosper. It's getting the metaphorical sunlight just right, the figurative humidity precise, and it's to recognize when the pot is no longer the right pot for the size or health of the plants within, and to do what it takes to ensure everyone inside is suitably cared for. We can only solve the housing crisis if we build gardens that suit all different kinds of seeds at all stages of growth and care for their intricacies. And I really believe that to house is to extend oneself to nurture another's growth that way, through physical materials and through building community, which I would call an act of love. Um, and so I believe we need to ask questions. I believe that we need to be curious. And I believe that we need to focus on housing as a verb rather than simply a noun in order to work our way through the challenges that we face. And that's house as a verb.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was wonderful, amazing. Um, so are there any questions for Robert?
Any questions in the chat?
Yeah, wait a second. What is in the chat?
I don't see anyone just yet.
Yeah, no, no, I don't see one either. I'm wondering, Rob, can you talk a little bit? You didn't talk very much about what you're doing right now. I mean, I can certainly see some of your recent activities really reflected in the talk. You know, your
For
interest,
sure.
the different kinds of crises are things that you've been trying to work through separately, like with
Sure,
tax, thinking about the climate crisis, and now with Better Home and Two Steps Home, thinking about maybe specifically homelessness
for sure.
and connection. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering, yeah, if you can talk a little bit about maybe your latest venture, the Better Home Project,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
how it's working.
For sure. So, working with Two Steps Home to push forward cabin communities as a model of response to encampments uh, in urban areas and also rural areas, but particularly well suited to more urban and denser areas, has been something I've been working on for a couple of years now. And these days, I do this as part of a group called Better Street with two wonderful colleagues of mine, Tony Stortz and Sophia Panasiuk. The concept here is that Better Street supports not-for-profits and other groups who are looking to build uh, forms of shelter or addiction treatment facilities, transitional housing, and projects that fall just outside of the traditional kind of catchment areas of the housing continuum. So if we think about the continuum going from encampments to emergency shelter to supportive housing to affordable housing and so on, we look for gaps in that process where it's challenging for people to move from one section to the next, and we look for solutions that will allow someone attempt to meet people where they're at and really say what's the thing that uh, can be built that will allow you uh, to meet you where you're at, to live in a way that um, works for you where you are, and help hold you as you move forward through this continuum. So, a couple of projects we're working on right now. One is the Cabin Community Project, and the real um, goal with that is helping to unblock the exit from encampments. Talking about the shelter system and some of the challenges that folks face with a lot of traditional shelters. This being a model that really emulates encampments in a way that a lot of people, a subset of the population, really benefits from. Is one project we're working on. We're also working on another project which is called a rural recovery village, and this model is uh, helping to unblock the process of folks who might be ready for and choosing to go through addictions treatment. So the challenge there is that quite often, if someone's in the shelter system or if someone's in a living situation where they're ready to go through that process. They feel driven to go through addictions treatment, to leave that part of their life behind. Uh, Going into detox for a week and then going through a rehab program for a month or so is incredibly demanding. It's physically very taxing. It's emotionally very taxing, and it is also something that is paid for. And to do that, to come out of that program and not have somewhere to be caught and held on the exit, often people fall back onto the street or back into the situation they were in before, where using their substance of choice was their means of numbing the pain of being in that living situation or numbing the pain of experiencing chronic homelessness. And so what we're looking at with this project is trying to uh, build something that catches people on the outset and helps prepare them so that they're able to move into affordable and supportive housing and be more successful in that program rather than kind of fall back into that same cycle that they were in before. Yeah.
The other thing I'm thinking about for students of architecture is that, you know, when I met you in, I don't know, 2022 or in 2023, I think you
I think it was
were
even earlier than that. Yeah,
you were finishing your master's degree.
I was.
And I think, you know, within the exhibition that we showed at the Canadian Pavilion in Venice, the work that you did in your master's thesis was very tightly bound with the work that you exhibited there as part
For
of
sure.
the intentional communities front house people. And I think like your journey and your experience in a way working with Khalil and Toronto Tiny Shelters, I think is
Yeah,
something really interesting for students to hear a little bit about.
for
Like,
sure.
I think, this talk you gave, I think is really inspirational and it's very deep knowledge. And, you're not long out of school. So there's a
Pretty
kind of
recent.
path,
Yeah,
there's a
all
kind of
things
pathway
considered.
you've taken that I think is really interesting for students to hear about.
For sure. Yeah. So yeah, as Adrian said, I was finishing up my Master's of Architecture in 2022, and the that whole process, my thesis project coming out of I was at University of Toronto. My thesis project at the end of that program was on cabin communities as a response to homelessness. I had already been working with a group, and we were trying to evolve this model and this idea. And so this was happening simultaneously with working on this in a academic context. But it allowed me to spend more time doing research, understanding the uh, kind of holistically how we can describe this model, how we can convey this model in a thoughtful way, and it gave me more time to speak with folks in encampments and do some of that on the ground research. Um, Around the same time, Adrian reached out about uh, putting this project together with a couple of other groups in uh, Ontario for as part of the Venice Biennale. So on like Architects Against Housing Alienations, Architects Against Housing Alienations Not for Sale campaign. Intentional communities for unhoused people was one of the topics. And I had previously been working with a group called Toronto Tiny Shelters during first COVID winter. So the idea there was that in the summer of 2020, the shelter system in Toronto had its capacity cut drastically. Any congregate settings of shelters that previously had, 80 beds that were spaced 3 feet apart in a big room had to be spaced 6 feet apart because of physical distancing. And so an influx of people fell into the parks, which during the summer, a lot of folks were able to manage. But in the wintertime, it was particularly challenging. And so the temporary emergency response was a good friend of mine, Khalil Sievewright, started building these little boxes for people that were framed like a house, but they were 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide and 8 feet long and on little wheels and had a window and a door and a fire alarm. And and was dropping them into parks for people who were otherwise going to be in a tent and trying to navigate that first winter. So I helped him with that project for a while, and we had a fair number of discussions around, what does a solution look like that, I mean, this was after the city of Toronto sued him and the tiny shelters had to be removed from parks, and the city ended up, I believe, incinerating some of them, which was quite a bit of salt on the wound. But nevertheless, we were thinking, what is a solution here that the city would be more willing to accept, and what's something that is can really kind of fit within the city of Toronto's housing and homelessness response kind of program. And as we were coming to terms with the cabin community model, we were reached out to by John Van Nostrand, the VN of SVN Architects, and he had said that he'd been working on a similar model for about 25 years, and wanted us to kind of put our heads together. And right as we did that, we were reached out to about the Venice Biennale project as well. So it was a real kind of confluence of different groups who all came together at exactly the same time with a very similar idea in mind. Um, we also worked with a Better Tent City of Waterloo region on the Venice Biennale project. And so personally, as a student at the time, it was I was quite lucky in that I was finishing this thesis project, and my instructors were willing to kind of let me have the scope of my thesis overlap with the work I was already doing, so that I could spend time working on drawings and imagery and storytelling and really trying to do what I could to support the Venice project within an academic context. Um, and then once that happened, Two Steps Home was turned into a not-for-profit, which I was working on off the side of my desk while I was working as net zero coordinator at TAS during my day job. And then in the last couple of years, I've shifted towards actually being able to kind of work for alongside Tony and Sophia at Better Street on several projects that are in this vein, and that be my full-time job, and I teach on the side, which I absolutely love.
And Tony Storts
Storts, yeah,
wrote a very interesting book, and
he
he
did.
he cut his teeth at a Better Chance City Waterloo region. So his
Yeah,
kind of first experience, or maybe not first, but substantive experience with tiny home communities came here in the Waterloo region with a Better
yeah,
Chance City, and then he moved on from that to start this consultancy that you're now partners in.
yeah, exactly. And I met Tony first at a Better Tent City in Kitchener, back in I want to say 2022. I met him there just very briefly, and then we eventually became friends and then coworkers, and now are doing all kinds of things. Yeah,
Amazing. Thanks, Rob. Are
yeah, of
there any
course.
other questions?
Hi, Robert.
Oh, hey Tim, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. How are you? Okay.
Good, good.
One of my question is like, I'm looking at your tiny shelter prototype, and is there like a mechanism to integrate the inhabitant identity that you have mentioned in your presentation? Because seeing the scale and the speed of deployment of those shelters, it reminds me of seeing a case of IKEA better shelter, and they are used in humanitarian crisis. And
Okay.
because this kind of prefabricated shelters, they always um I mean, in some sense they're trying to integrate some customizations ability. Every design is trying to do that, and I also wonder, like, in your design, is there also some mechanism to integrate that? And also or like, is this shelter a replacement or a supplement of the existing, like, larger shelter? Because, um, as you have explained in the needs pyramid, like this two type of shelter, the type that you're proposing right now and the existing type, like serve differently, in terms of the needs of people. Like this kind of small shelters may serve better of the psychological needs of people. So I wonder, like, this type of proposal, is it trying to replace the existing shelter, or is it because there is not enough room for the existing shelter, so you are supplementing it? And can you explain a little bit on this? Thank you.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. I feel very heard, which is that's lovely. I'll start with the first one. So on that kind of sense of customization of the unit. For me personally, I actually believe that that's one of the most important aspects of the cabin community model. Um, is the ability that, when you're in this little unit, this is your space. You have a door that locks. You have space to store your belongings. Your things aren't going to get stolen. This unit is your unit, and you can come back to this unit because you live in this community. And you know the people around you, and they'll be able to support you and look after your unit and yourself as you would them and theirs. Um, in terms of the actual structure and being able to make it the way that you like, the real benefit here is you can kind of do with these what you please. Like if you want to add shelves, if you want to put art up on the wall, you're more than able to do that. If you're someone who takes great joy from painting, if you're someone who takes great joy from playing music, if you play the guitar, for instance, there isn't really an opportunity for you to do this in the shelter system. You might in a park, but if you're going to go into the shelter, you can only bring 2 bags worth of things, and they're not going to allow you to go in with your guitar. Which means it has to be stored somewhere. Like very, very basic, fundamental things that bring us a sense of connection and bring us a sense of joy in life, oftentimes are not permitted from the shelter. Pets are another one. You very seldomly are able to go to the shelter system with a dog, and so that precludes you, meaning that you end up in a tent in the park in the winter. And so with this model, it's really to say, yes, bring your animal in. This little unit is yours. Yes, you can play guitar because you have a little space to do it. And if people don't want to hear you singing that loudly, close your door. And it's reasonably well insulated in there. So on that front, the ability for personal agency is really kind of an important piece here. And if we kind of look at that, my hierarchy of needs turned sideways. The ability to take up hobbies, the ability to come and go as you please, to curate the space to your liking, to have a say in the rules that govern your life to some degree and contribute to communal decisions. Maybe you want to have a mural on the washroom wall of the cabin community. Um, these are things that I think are particularly resonant with this model for folks who are otherwise using tents in parks as a way to exist. Um, I think in terms of whether this model would replace the shelter system, I think it's a companion to the existing shelter system. I think it's a model that helps people decompress more effectively from chronic homelessness in such a way that once they are able to move into supportive housing or transitional housing, um, that they'll be more successful in that because this first level of decompression has already happened. Um, rather than if you're someone who, Tony has a great analogy of if homelessness is like being underwater, deep, deep in the ocean, very high pressure environment. You can't be pulled up too quickly. You'll get the bends, decompression sickness. And so the process of decompression has to be slow. The body has to acclimatize to it. Your mind has to acclimatize to it. Um, and emotionally, you have to be at that place. And so being able to do that decompression process at a speed that works for the individual is something that these communities, again, are very, very well positioned to do. And so I see this as being a very strong means of helping people permanently exit homelessness. But of course, it's challenging to build a community for every single person. Let's say in the city of Toronto, there are 15,000 people who are unhoused in a given night. And to go through the process of trying to build a community for everyone is not going to be able to happen in a very timely manner. And so to have some congregate settings and treat this as yet another step on that continuum. From an encampment, it's a very cold night. If you're able to get a spot in a warming center or an emergency shelter, you're there and maybe until a cabin spot opens up. You move into a cabin and you from there move on to permanent housing or supportive housing. Maybe you're someone who's from an encampment, and if you can just get a spot in a cabin for 6 months, you'll be good to go. You'll be good to move on, and that's perfect. You do that, your space opens up for the next person. It's not a solution that's necessary for everybody. A lot of folks are come from housing, don't have a place to be, and are crashing with friends or are living wherever they are just until they're able to land back on their feet again. But they don't necessarily need the deep transitional support that this type of thing provides. And so maybe it makes more sense to try to just get on a wait list and move into something as it comes up. But in terms of shelters and in terms of um, wait, there we go. And in terms of transitional or like emergency shelter, we really think that this model tries to kind of combine the best of both worlds.
Thank you for your elaboration.
Yeah, of course.
So, Rob, thank you so much for this lecture. That
Of
was really
course.
amazing. Yeah.
Of course. Am I right that this is the final lecture of AHA's 2025-26 programming?
Yeah. Yeah. I
What
think
an
the last thing
honor.
we'll do is kind of a wrap-up roundtable in the coming month.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Rob.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks for having me, and thank you folks for listening.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
All right. Same to you. Take good care.